Welcome to the B'nai B'rith International podcast. I'm your host, CEO Dan Mariaschin. We appreciate your spending some time with us today. I'm pleased today to be joined by Einat Wilf and Adi Schwartz, authors of the new book, The War of Return: How Western Indulgence of the Palestinian Dream Has Obstructed the Path to Peace. In their work, Wilf and Schwartz explore in well-researched detail how the Palestinians have used the refugee issue and the right of return to consistently thwart efforts to achieve a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In order to do that, they write, the Palestinians and the international community must come to terms with the fact that there will be no right of return and that their continued call for it has no basis in international law. Einat Wilf has served as a member of Knesset. Among other roles, she previously served as senior fellow at the Jewish People Policy Institute and foreign policy advisor to Shimon Peres. Wilf is also the author of a number of books that explore key issues in Israeli society, including Winning the War of Words, Essays on Zionism and Israel. Adi Schwartz is a Tel Aviv-based freelance researcher and journalist who is a former staff writer and senior editor for Haaretz. He has particular expertise on the Palestinian refugee issue and Israeli and Jewish current affairs. Schwartz is currently writing his PhD dissertation at Bar Ilan University on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Welcome to the program, Einat. Welcome, Adi. Well, let's start at the beginning. Your book has received a great deal of attention, and the question really is, why did it take 72 years, or let's put it even further up, why has it taken so long for this complete story to be told?
It's difficult to know why it has taken a while for this story to be told, and for making sure that it actually gets the attention it deserves as the most important issue in the conflict. And I think at least one of the reasons is that especially people who wanted peace, who want to see this conflict over, really were hoping that there is another story there, that there is a story about land, that there is a story about basically two peoples, each wanting a state in the land, and that there is a solution at hand, a very simple one and straightforward one, which is about dividing the land between those two peoples. And that makes for a very simple story and at least a hopeful story. Our story is a more difficult one. It's a story that is kind of a tough life lesson one. It tells people there are no shortcuts. If you want to resolve the conflict, you have to get to the heart of the matter. And the heart of the matter is and has always been the fact that the Palestinians have refused to accept the Jewish people as equal claimants to the land and have insisted on this idea of a right of return as a way to undo the state of Israel, which they continue to believe is a unique injustice. That's a far more difficult story. And in general, I think people like better stories with a potential easy, happy end than there are no shortcut in life stories.
So in 1947, the UN partitions the Palestine mandate into an Arab state and a Jewish state. The Arabs declare war on Israel. The war ends in December of 1948. And then two things happen. The United Nations adopts UN Resolution 194, which has been a resolution that has been referred to in various ways over the years. And then a year later, in December of 1949, UNRWA, which is the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, was founded. Tell us about 194 and how that's impacted this issue. And then let's begin the discussion about UNRWA and its role and its original intent.
So let's start with 194, which I think actually the number nobody would have remembered today unless the Palestinians used it since then, and perhaps not only the Palestinians, but Arab states, claiming that supposedly this resolution grants them a right of return, which it does not. So what is it? What is Resolution 194? It is a General Assembly resolution, as you said, in December 1948, basically outlining a framework for a peace agreement between Israel and the Arab states, finalizing the war. Now, it had 15 clauses. One of them was a very typical article for a peace agreements that all sides and all parties agree to solve their problems peacefully, for example. Another article called for economic cooperation for the benefit of all people, etc., etc. There was one particular article, number 11, and this is the only one which the Palestinians mentioned to this day, which called for the refugees who wish to return and want to live peacefully with the surrounding, they should be allowed to do that. They should be allowed to return or to be compensated. Now, as you see, the wording of the resolution does not grant a right of return. The term right of return does not even appear there. It is very, Israel has to agree, and the people have to be able to say that they are willing to live in peace with their neighbors. And there was also the option of compensation. So it does not grant a right of return. Interestingly, the Arab countries, the Arab states, when this resolution came to vote, they all voted against, because again, this was a framework for peace. Arab countries had no intention whatsoever in December 1948, when the war ended, to sign a peace agreement with Israel. But a few weeks later, they decided in I must admit, a very acrobatic diplomatic move, to cling only to one article, Article 11, while ignoring totally the idea of the resolution, which was peace, ignoring every other article, such as economic benefit of the area, because as we know, they decided to boycott economically the state of Israel. So ignoring all other articles and just clinging to one article, that Article 11, claiming that this gives them some kind, the Palestinian refugees, gives them a right to return. Now, just to mention that legally, resolutions, General Assembly resolutions are not binding according to international law. United Nations Charter mentions it specifically, that the General Assembly is a very general decision, a very general area of discussion, and resolutions does not have any binding effect. So that is the overall environment of Resolution 194, but this does not affect the position of the Palestinians to this day, that 194 somehow grants them an inalienable right to return to their homes.
Before we get into the creation of UNRWA, I mean, let's step back a second. In essence, as a result of the war, there was really an exchange of populations, not unlike what had occurred a number of times in Europe, that there were hundreds of thousands, some people say as many as 850,000 over a period of about maybe 12 years, Jews who came from Arab countries, who were forced out of Arab countries and found a home in Israel. Those Palestinians who left, there was a special situation created for them, unlike all of the other exchanges of populations and refugee situations that had been occurring not only in Europe after World War II, but before that as well. Why was there a situation where the Palestinians were granted a special situation?
So indeed, the context of the 20th century, and especially the mid-20th century, where the Palestinian refugee issue emerges, the entire context of the 20th century is one of transition from empires to nation states. In this context of bloody wars and partitions and civil wars and delineating of borders once empires disappear and collapse, is that populations move. Just like you said, there are exchanges of populations and expulsions, and hundreds of millions, if not, hundreds of millions of refugees are created throughout the world, in Europe, in Asia, in Africa. And all of them move on. The general message to all refugees throughout the 20th century is, yes, it's a tragedy, war is terrible, you lost your homes, but you're not going back. And you move on, and refugees built their lives to the places where they fled or new places, which is why we don't have any refugees from wars of the mid-20th century, except the Palestinians. Now, the Palestinians initially were treated in a way that was not different than others. UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency, was established as a temporary agency, which, by the way, after 70 years, it still is. We bring in the book the story of UNCRA, another temporary agency for the Korean refugees from a war that happens around the same time. The reason that it was a temporary agency was because the notion was that it would be focused on settling the Arab refugees in place and then closed down once they're all settled. And just to remember, they are Arabs, they share the same ethnicity, the same language, the same history, the same religion for most cases. So in all other cases where that was the situation, people were absorbed, refugees were absorbed into their surroundings. And that was the assumption, that they would be absorbed into Jordan, where the vast majority of them were, including the West Bank, in Syria and Lebanon. And UNRWA was established and giving funding and a lot of support by the US and the UK for that to happen. But unlike UNCRA with the Koreans that achieved its goals, settled the refugees, no one went back to their homes with a lot less money than UNRWA. And look at where South Korea is today. That could have been the Palestinians. But unlike UNCRA, the Palestinians, the Arab refugees, and the Arab states reject any form of settling the refugees because they know that if that were to happen, the war of 1948 would be essentially considered over. And that they didn't want. They wanted to keep the war of 1948 open so that they can undo it at a later time. And this is where we are to the present. UNRWA recently celebrated 70 years of existence. It should be not proud of being 70 years in existence. It should be ashamed because it is still temporary after 70 years. It should have closed down after a few years, having settled all the Arab refugees and moved on. But the Arab refugees themselves and the Arab states did not want to move on and did not want to accept that the war of 1948 and its consequences in the form of an independent state of Israel is a done deal.
So UNRWA becomes a permanent temporary organization with a bloated bureaucracy. And it starts registering Palestinian refugees. Now they're living in not only in the West Bank, living in Jordan, they're living in Syria and Lebanon. Tell us about this registration program that has moved today to a point where we're talking about millions of people, even though there may be perhaps 40,000 original refugees perhaps living. How did that happen? How did they get away with it?
So indeed, in the beginning, UNRWA starts out as a quite benign and positive attempt, as Einat just explained, mainly financed by the West, by the United States and the United Kingdom, trying to bring back, reintegrate, resettle those refugees who were displaced during the war. And very quickly, already in the middle of the 50s, we have evidence to the fact that the standard of living of all those refugees is higher than what they had prior to 1948 and is at least the same as many other people living in the Arab world. But then, due to geostrategic reasons, the international community decided that it is not going to close down UNRWA, but to maintain it as it is. Now, with no humanitarian basis, when the standard of living was already high, everything that UNRWA had to do is to find something to do. They had nothing to do by that time. They could have closed the organization, but they had to survive. They had to sustain themselves and keep on going. So they started, for example, a huge education system. By now, everything that UNRWA is doing is an education system and a healthcare system. So they have a huge system. It's basically a welfare state of hundreds of schools and tens of thousands of teachers, and the same goes with the healthcare system. Now, very quickly, children were born, and by now grandchildren and fourth and fifth generation. And UNRWA decided to register all those descendants as refugees as well. Now, one thing which is important to understand is that UNRWA is responsible for creating their own rules. You will not find anywhere in international law or in a Security Council resolution what exactly is the definition of a Palestinian refugee. It is only the definitions of UNRWA. Now, what makes it peculiar is the fact that since its inception in 1949 to this day, there wasn't even one Palestinian refugee who was resettled or taken off the list. So that is the reason how from a number of 700,000, nowadays you have more than 5.5 million registered by UNRWA. By the way, the Palestinians themselves count much more because they count also people who arrived in Sweden or in Germany or in the United States and already have new passports. So for them, they are also considered as refugees. But even according to UNRWA, now there are about 5.5 million refugees. One more thing is that it's a combination of this unique status. The status of Palestinian refugees is different. The definition is different from any other refugee in the world. And if you add to it the fact that they have never done anything to resettle them, that makes for the outcome of a huge number of refugees. It is the only group of refugees whose number only increases. When you look at any other group, you will see that the number decreases and increases according to events. If a large number can go back or resettle, or there was a peace plan, etc., the numbers change. Only with the Palestinians, the number only increase, and it will increase next year and the next and the year after, as long as this charade will not end.
How important was the education system in UNRWA in reinforcing the promise of a return? In other words, keeping these fires burning as a political wedge, as a political issue.
So one of the most shocking realizations for us in working on the book and doing the research is to discover the major role of UNRWA in basically creating the Palestinian national consciousness. Now, the connection between a national consciousness and a national education system is nationalism 101. Basically, every nation creates the sense of collective identity through its education system. But what's interesting in UNRWA is that you first have the UNRWA schools, and then thereby they become the vehicle that creates the Palestinian national collective, the Palestinian national consciousness. Now, that in itself would not be an issue. A lot of nations and national collectives were essentially formulated and born in the 20th century. That was the century of the birth of nations. But what's unique about UNRWA is that it constituted the Palestinian national consciousness singularly around the issue of revenge and return. So to be a Palestinian became to be a person who demands this idea of return. And return seems benign. Sometimes I think we should just define return as what Palestinians demand is the superior right to settle within the sovereign state of Israel in their millions in breach of Israeli sovereignty. Maybe if I said it this way, people would understand why no such right exists in international law. But this is what the Palestinians began to kind of believe and became part of their national consciousness in the UNRWA schools. And it became their national identity, that their ultimate cause is this idea of return, is this idea of liberating Palestine, which is not the West Bank and Gaza, but is Israel, that this is their unique just cause, that they are a nation of refugees who suffered a unique and unparalleled injustice in history, and therefore it is incumbent upon them to seek justice. And in the Palestinian wording, justice means only one thing, which is no Israel. And the UNRWA schools were critical of that. In the book, we tell the story of the perpetrators of the Munich massacre of the Israeli Olympic players. And the perpetrators were almost all children of the refugee camps who grew up in the UNRWA education system to believe that they must exact revenge. I mean, you need to believe that in order to slaughter and torture athletes in an Olympic game. And to still be proud of it. The ones who are alive are still very proud of this act of terrorism. And we quote one person who said, Fatah can only train one warrior, one terrorist at a time, but UNRWA trains and prepares the hearts of the masses. And that's what UNRWA did and still does.
So, founded in 1949, and we're moving through decades now, but once the international community settled into the, shall we call it, the UNRWA way, that process became cast in concrete by the Cold War. So the West, fearing that it might lose the Arabs to the Soviets, more or less allowed the perpetuation of this problem by doing nothing. At what point did that happen? That someone said, let's say in the foreign ministries and in the State Department, and said, well, let's leave this and not touch it because we're afraid this could be to the Soviet advantage if we do.
Exactly. So we found cables running back from the Middle East to Washington as early as 1952 from for example, the ambassador in Amman, in Jordan, saying, listen, guys, this whole UNRWA thing, they're doing nothing. They're not cooperating with us, neither the Palestinians themselves nor the Arab governments. We're just wasting our money and energy, and we have to change course. Now, this was already in 1952. But then discussions began in Washington how to change UNRWA, how to do something else, a different model. And when Arab leaders understood that this is where things are going, they came to Washington, and we detail a scene in the book where the Saudi ambassador in the United States comes to the State Department and says, listen, guys, you don't want to do it. And he basically tells them, the Americans, that they already once made a very grave mistake. That was the partition plan, that they agreed to the creation of a Jewish state. And now, a decade later, we are talking about the end of the 50s, the Arab world would consider closing down UNRWA as the same as the decision for the partition plan. So he basically blackmails the Americans, and there is even considerations of closing the Suez Canal and putting some special taxes on every ship that goes through the Suez Canal. And you have to remember that this was a very different world. First of all, the Arab world was much more united. There was such a thing as an Arab world. The Arab League was stronger. For example, leaders as Nasser, who were pan-Arab and were talking in the name and were really powerful, I mean, in relation to what we have today. The economic and geostrategic situation was totally different. This was the Cold War. And the fear of the Americans was that if they leave the Arab world unsatisfied somehow, and the Soviet Union, it would be much easier for them to take control over the area. There were real economic issues. That was the decade right after the war, World War II, where Europe really needed Arab oil, and all the American program for the reconstruction of Europe was around the economic free flow of oil. So all of these ideas together made it for the Americans to come to the decision that, with all due respect to this minor issue of UNRWA, $100 million, $200 million, they have bigger issues. Remember, 1961, you have the big issue of the Berlin airlift, etc., etc. There were so many wars, the Cuba crisis. So deciding to keep and throwing this money, continuing UNRWA, seemed like the lesser evil. They even thought that, okay, this is a United Nations organization. How bad can it be? It should have been something neutral. To be honest, what happened is a much worse situation, because as Einat said, the Americans, mainly the Americans, but the West, thought that they put this issue into into freezing. Nothing bad will happen. But as we now know, UNRWA and the entire refugee camp culture, as we call it, was the incubator of the PLO, of the terror attacks that happened in the 60s and the 70s. So the West thought that, okay, we can live with it, but the effects were detrimental. If you look on the safety of Jordan, if you look at the Black September, that also started in the refugee camps. The Lebanese civil war, the Palestinians in the refugee camps also had a role there. So this entire construct of UNRWA and refugee camps had very, very negative effects, not only on Israel, but on the entire region.
Einat, how did the right of return as an issue work its way into the various attempts at negotiating peace, particularly after Oslo?
So once the Palestinians lose the backing of the Soviet Union, they turn to the West, and especially to the US, for support. And in the process of turning to the US, they begin to speak in an American language. They speak of rights. They speak of justice. They begin to speak of self-determination. Now, they do not actually make a strategic choice to part with the idea of liberating Palestine from the river to the sea, but they speak in a way that sounds moderate to Western ears, and more Westerners begin to believe that the Palestinians and their leadership have made a true break with the past and are now only interested in a Palestinian state in part of the land. So the assumption throughout the 90s is that the Palestinians are truly ready for partition of the land in a way that it was envisioned by the UN in 1947 between an Arab state and a Jewish state. Now, the Palestinians have made no such transition, as we show in the book, in all their pronouncements, in all their documents. They do not break with the past. They continue their attachment for this idea that millions of them possess this right of return. And of course, what happens is that when they declare their support for two states, everyone in the West, including Israeli peacemakers, Israeli on the left, people like Adi and myself, believe that the Palestinians are really ready for a two-state solution. And everyone forgets about this idea of return. Nobody takes it seriously. Everyone thinks it's just a bargaining chip that they will forego when they can actually get hard cash, which means territory. Once they will be given a proper proposal, then they're going to give up this nonsense of right of return, because just to be clear on the numbers, if a Palestinian says they support a two-state solution, which they say they do today, but they say that the right of return is sacred, which they also say if asked, then the only two states they envision in a peace agreement is a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, and another Palestinian state to replace Israel. There is no peaceful Palestinian vision in which Israel is allowed to remain as is, as the sovereign state of the Jewish people. Now, what happens throughout the negotiations of the 90s, this is the assumption certainly in the Western side and in the Israeli side, that the Palestinians are ready for a two-state solution. And when Ehud Barak goes to Camp David in 2000 with this assumption and his negotiating team, and he puts on the table a proposal for a full Palestinian state, fully sovereign, which means an end to the occupation in the West Bank, and no settlements. Settlements were either going to be dismantled or exchanged for equivalent land and capital in East Jerusalem, including in the Old City, holy sites. So he gives the Palestinian the hard cash, the territory that everyone believed is what they were waiting for. And what happened is they walk away. This happens again with Abu Mazen and Olmert in 2008. They walk away from concrete opportunities to have a state because the idea of return was never a bargaining chip in the service of another goal, such as statehood. It was always and still is the goal itself. So when given the choice between statehood and return, Palestinians have repeatedly chosen to forgo statehood if that meant that they would have to close the lid on any possibility of return. And this, of course, came as a shock to the negotiating team. It came as shock to Israelis of the peace camp. And this is what drove people like Adi and myself back to the drawing board to see, well, what is really the conflict about if they didn't take the opportunities of having a state?
Yeah, sometimes I think there's a certain naivete, or maybe it's not naivete. Maybe it's we have our own diplomatic experience, which is based on, at least here in this country, two parties differ. You sit at a table, you even lock the door, throw away the key. But at the end of a session, you shake hands and you have an agreement on something. We have it in labor negotiations here. You have it in business negotiations. It goes on all the time. So I think there's a certain assumption that everybody else in the world just operates the same way. Now, in these various negotiations, from time to time, there have been various proposals that there would be 25,000 Palestinians who would come back, family reunification. But you're saying really that the Palestinians have probably scoff at that and say, well, that's not what we're looking for. So is it, you think it's denial that has driven this issue in the international community? Is it obliviousness? Is it naivete, which I mentioned, that fails to see how much this issue has become such an obstacle to progress over all of these decades?
I think, first of all, that you're totally right. And this was the intention or the thought of many people also here in Israel. We have a problem. Let's try to solve it pragmatically, right? You have two kids arguing over, something. Then you give it to one of them for half of the time, and for the other one the second half. So somehow you manage to reach some kind of a formula. But for the Palestinians, the issue is not necessarily if 25,000 people or 55,000 people. The issue of the refugees is the symbol for the entire worldview of this conflict. The conflict as not being between two equal rights, or let's say that both sides, Jews and Arab, have some rights over the land. No, for them, for the Palestinians, this is a conflict such as that between France and Algeria, or the British and India. For them, it is simply inconceivable to come to the Indians and tell them, okay, let's partition India between the Indians and the British. Or to the Algerians, let's partition the land between the French and the Algerians. So for them, it is simply injustice, and 100% should be theirs. Now, if you ask why, or is it a denial, or what's the reason? So A, we prefer to try the easiest way, that's one. Second, I do think that the interest that were for so many years so strong and gave the Arabs very strong political clout, and I'm talking about the oil, I'm talking about the presence of the Arab bloc. And actually, this is a point of optimism because we are now at a very different point. There is no Arab world, certainly not in the sense that we were talking about in the 50s. Soviet Union is not there anymore. So I can understand the British and Americans in the 50s and 60s that telling themselves, okay, we can't solve this. Let's try to make some kind of a status quo and live with what we have, you know? Now the situation is different. If anything, you're getting very good messages from Saudi Arabia, and perhaps I should say some messages, and from Gulf states, and they're saying, well, we're not interested in this anymore. We're not interested in perpetuating the Palestinian problem. On the other hand, you hear foreign ministers or like the Emirati who's saying, okay, we have our differences with Israel, but we should have some kind of a cooperation on other issues. I think this is exactly the time the West should realize that the reasons for maintaining UNRWA in the 50s are not there anymore. There is no reason to continue with this infinite, flow of money, of diplomatic support. It is high time, if they really want to promote peace and the security of this area, that this charade of endless number of refugees forever should stop. So I think actually there's also a point of optimism in this.
No, I would agree with that, but I think, that's around the center. The center still has this intransigence on the part of the Palestinians on this issue, and I would say there's a companion issue to it as well, which is this denial not only of the right, the refusal to recognize Israel as a Jewish state, but more importantly, perhaps, the idea of rejecting the notion of a Jewish attachment, Israeli attachment, to the land itself, the historical connection. So it's good to see what's happening, not around the edges, because it's more than around the edges. There are some important things that are happening, but still we have this intransigence really at the center. Now, before we leave, your book also makes some recommendations, Einat, about how to move away from UNRWA and to put this issue at least into the hands in the UN, perhaps, of the High Commissioner for Refugees, like every other refugee situation, or some other ways to take it out of UNRWA. And you also comment on the defunding by the Trump administration of UNRWA, and you say some things about how that focused more or less on corruption rather than the issue at hand. So tell us about the proposals that you're making.
So our proposal comes from a basic idea that sounds truly banal, that if we are to ever have peace, the war must be over, right? This is basic. And UNRWA and this endless refugee situation is keeping for Palestinians the idea that the war of 1948 is not over. This is why we have this situation, because from their perspective, the war of 1948 is not yet over. And in their mind, they can still win it, which means they can still undo the establishment of the State of Israel in the course of that war. So the war must be over. How do you send the message that the war is over, which was the message to all other refugees in the world? The war is over, move on. How do you send that message? First and foremost, by closing down UNRWA completely, not reforming it. It's not a reformable body because its core being is keeping the war open. So we have specific proposals. The amazing thing about the whole refugee issue is that it is the biggest issue, let's say mentally, ideologically, in terms of keeping the war open. But in practice, it's a very small issue because 40% of the refugees are citizens of Jordan, which means they're not refugees. Citizens are not refugees. The other 40% live in the West Bank and Gaza, which means this is where they are. This is where their future is going to be. So they're not refugees. Another 20% who are registered in Syria and Lebanon, we by now have enough data to know that most of them are long gone. So the actual problem is probably 200, 300,000 people who are living without a national status in Syria and Lebanon. And these are exactly the kinds of numbers that the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees knows how to handle through local settlements or resettlement in third countries. And in doing so, within 5 to 10 years, the entire number of Palestinian refugees could be brought down to zero. So the problem is actually very small. We show what steps need to be taken, dismantle UNRWA, make it clear that Palestinians are not refugees. For the few who need a national status, take care of that. Make clear that Resolution 194 does not give them the inalienable rights to undo Israeli sovereignty and settle within the state of Israel. Take all of these things together, and then the message that the war of 1948 might begin to get through, which means then we are finally set on a course towards peace once it's clear that the war is over.
Well, we come to the end of our time. I have to tell you, I think your book should be required reading for every diplomat who works on Middle East issues, every diplomat, let's say, not even on Middle East issues. Or every journalist who writes about the region. I think you made an exceedingly important contribution to understanding why it is that the Israeli-Palestinian issue has to this day gone unresolved. And really, we thank you for doing this book, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Well, thanks to Einat Wilf and Adi Schwartz for joining me, and thank you for tuning in. If you like what you've heard so far, make sure you never miss a show by clicking the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts. Also, be sure to visit our website, b'nai-brit.org, to learn about our work, and like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. For my guests, Einat Wilf and Adi Schwartz, I'm your host, Dan Mariaschin. We'll talk to you next time on the B'nai Brit International Podcast.